The term toxic masculinity is doing more damage than good, and we need to stop using it. Join me and Jeddy Azuma for a powerful conversation that sheds light on what it really means to be a man. In this episode, you'll learn the distinction between man woman, masculine feminine, and male female. You'll also learn how our current culture of punishment is making it harder for men to do men's work, why men may feel unsafe to be around other men, the importance of having a rite of initiation into manhood, why men need the support and acknowledgement from other men, and why we need to stop using the label toxic masculinity. Host of the top rated podcast, the Rising Man podcast, and creator of the Rising Man movement, Jeddy Azuma has been in the field of men's leadership and empowerment for the past 10 years. As a Rites of Passage guide, mentor, and leadership coach, Jeddy has impacted the lives of hundreds of men on his mission to initiate an entire generation of men into power and purpose driven service to the world. Despite his many roles and contributions to men's work, Jeddy considers his most important job to be that of father and husband. This is such an important conversation for all of us to be having right now. So please take the time to listen, take notes, and share this episode with anyone in your life who you feel would benefit from hearing Jeddy's message. Now, just as a reminder, my upcoming book, Potent Leadership, will be released soon. I promise you it's coming. Get on the waitlist at rubyfremon.com/book waitlist. And if you're on the wait list, you're going to be first in line to get the book as well as the bonuses that I'll be launching with the book release. You can also text hashtag book launch to 1781-336-0160 and get added to the book waitlist that way. Now, if you dig the podcast and you want to connect outside of the podcast, please head to rubyfremon.com/connect to be part of my email community. You can also text hashtag TTL to 1781-336-0160 if you prefer to stay in touch via text message. And finally, if you are a loyal thought leader or a brand new listener, please take a moment to drop a rating and review on iTunes, as well as download a few episodes. All of this helps me get this podcast to more leaders around the world. Now, it is time to rethink toxic masculinity with Jeddy Azuma. Hey, thought leaders, I'm back with a fresh new episode and a fresh new guest who goes by the name of Jeddy Azuma. And Jeddy and I have been in each other's peripheral worlds for quite some time, and we've just recently started connecting. And I have to say, I am a huge fan of the work that he does in our world. And I really, honestly, truly believe that the work that he does is of the utmost importance, especially now. And you're going to learn why. So, Jeddy, welcome to today's Thought Leader. I'm super excited to have you here.
So grateful to be here and to be finally connecting with you as well. It's really nice to finally sit down and jam.
I know it's one thing to like know someone from social media, from Instagram, and it's another thing to actually just have a conversation.
Yeah, how rare that is these days, right? We kind of skip that step. We're like, I know
Right.
you. I've been following you for 2 years on Instagram. It's like,
Right.
no, not even.
So I'm happy to say that we are connecting now and we're getting to know each other and getting to dive beyond the Instagram profile pic and bio.
Yes, yes.
And I'm excited to do more of that deep dive in today's conversation. And
Hmm.
I'd love to just start off with, I mean, uh, you say that you prepare the next generation of men to lead. And I love that. And, men's work isn't something that's super new. It's being done in a multitude of different ways nowadays, which is great to see. And what I'm interested in is why you got into men's work in the first place. I'd love to just provide some context for our listeners.
Well, it's really simple. I was in my early 20s and a very similar position that I find a lot of young men are. You know, I'm in my early 20s. I don't quite yet know what I want to do. Experiencing the vastness of the world and the human experience and looking around and not seeing anybody that could really help me understand my experience.
Mm,
I was surrounded by a lot of really great people, but we were all equally confused and in the same position as the other person. So I was doing what a lot of young men do, men that I support now. I was numbing myself. I was smoking too much weed. I was going out and partying, having a lot of awesome experiences, but I wasn't really connecting to something that was bigger than myself.
mm,
And so that pain led me on a journey, several thousand miles, all different types of experiences. I left a career behind, a community behind in New York City, and traveled for 4 months, and
mm,
finally encountered men that I could bounce and be mirrored by, men
mhm,
who helped me understand what it was that I was actually looking for and how I could get there.
mhm,
And at the same time, I found rites of passage, and all of a sudden, the dots started to connect. The things that I was missing, the things that were absent in my life, a culture around becoming a man,
mm,
more than, well, you go to college, you get a job, you get married, and you have a family, because
mhm,
that wasn't enough for me. And so going through my own process and then turning around and looking and seeing there's still so many men who are in the same confused position I was in, I
mhm,
was like, no, I have to turn back around and reach out my hands. That's why I got started in this
mm.
work, and it's continued to evolve and take shape as I've traveled that path.
Yeah, it's so interesting. As a woman, I know firsthand the traumas that we have, women with women, and I've navigated that territory. And I work with men and women in my work, and there's always it's like there's this different um, relationship bond between with man versus man that um, is so interesting to me, just not being a man and not being from that space, but being able to witness just even in my own spaces and retreats when men come together but are really able to, like you said, mirror each other and see each other. And I almost see like their shoulders dropping in that moment and a softening, like finally. And I'm so
Mm.
curious to hear your take on why we don't have that in relationships with men. Like why we don't have that off the get-go.
Why women don't have that in
No,
relationships with men?
men, like why it
Oh, why
takes.
men don't have that?
Yeah.
Oh,
Like
well,
why does it take why is it hard for them to really understand what it takes to quote unquote be a man, or like have that rite of passage into manhood, or even like brotherhood? What's the
mhm.
disconnect that you've witnessed?
It's just the legacy of manhood and masculinity, the narrative that most of us in the Western modern world have received.
Mm,
The machismo,
mm,
the story, the vulnerability is weakness
mm,
story, the lone wolf, self-made man story. I mean, this is nothing new. This is stuff that everybody's talking about now, which is great.
yeah,
Problem is it's not enough to just talk about it. We
yeah,
actually have to be in those experiences, like you said, of actually getting together with other humans who share our experience, who've encountered the wounds, who have seen their fathers and their uncles model what a lot of people call this toxic masculinity,
mm,
but really is just an extension of boyhood that never matured.
mm,
And then also experiencing the repercussions of perpetual boyhood and I guess just the negative encounters that boys have had with other boys and with men that have shaped their understanding of I'm not really safe. I'm not really safe in relationship with other men because they're going to try to hurt me. They're going to try and compete with me. They're going to try and knock me down. And
mm,
the reality is that we're so much more capable together
mhm,
when we're working in collaboration. I mean, our ancestors used to take down woolly mammoths together
mhm,
to feed their families. That's what we do at our finest.
mhm,
But somewhere along the way we got away from that because we felt there was this need to compete with one another to be better than somebody else. And I think it's really a western, more like colonial modern concept. It's not when you talk to people from indigenous and more traditional cultures, that's not the story of manhood and masculinity. It's completely different.
mhm. Yeah, that's so interesting when you said feeling like I'm not safe, because that's
Hmm.
something that we as women have with each other too. Like we don't feel safe. I've never really heard a man say that about men, like not feeling safe around other men. Could you just share a bit more about that? I'm curious to know what that is.
Yeah, well, for anyone who identifies as a man who's listening, they know
Mm-hmm.
exactly what I'm talking about. For
Mm,
people who don't have that experience, it's being a 13-year-old boy
mm,
and being in the locker room, and a boy who's not maturing as quickly as the other boys, and is ridiculed and put down because he hasn't hit puberty yet, or because his
mm,
voice is squeaky. Those small things that are, as an adult, you look back and you say, oh, who cares? They're making
mm-hmm.
fun of your squeaky voice. But we're just the same when we take man or woman, the title, the designator, off of who we are. All we want at a base level is connection. We
Mm,
want to be a part of, and those experiences tell us that we don't belong.
mm-hmm.
So that sense of safety, we gathered safety and a sense of safety by being in community with each other. That's what we've done since the beginning of humans.
Mm-hmm.
But anything that compromises that or affects our sense of well-being, that I belong here, I'm cared for, I'm welcome, I'm valuable,
Mm-hmm.
is a very unsettling and unsafe feeling for any human, really, but particularly boys and men.
Mm, mm. It's interesting because in the perception of man, especially like you say in Western culture, is that of like we have to be strong, we have to be this, we have to be the pillars, we have to hold it together, we have to, um, there's like almost like a display about it,
Hmm.
and so many of the men that are in my circle that are in the work, there's a depth that of connection that they haven't yet been able to tap into, and they're tapping into now through this work. um and once they do, to witness a man going through that, there's like this beautiful transformative process that it almost like it shifts their whole inner world, it shifts their outer world, it shifts the way that they show up.
Hmm.
It's really beautiful to witness as a woman on the other side of that as well, because it shifts the relationships and the dynamics around them. Why do you believe that this work is so important right now?
Well, I want to speak to what you just said for a minute,
Yeah.
because the big problem with that macho mentality
Mm-hmm.
is that it's dishonest. and,
Mm-hmm.
and the and the most, I mean, dishonesty is probably the biggest detriment to trust and a sense of overall safety for a community, right?
Mm-hmm.
If somebody's being inauthentic, that's probably the worst thing you could do to a community, is inject
Mm.
yourself into there and not be genuine.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that men are not capable of being courageous. I mean, there's warriors on this planet who've
Mm-hmm.
done some incredible things, but it's the false sentiment that there's an absence of fear
Mm-hmm.
required to be a warrior, that plays into that machismo. So
Mm.
it's not taking away the the best things that we do as men, because one of the things we do best as men is protect and guard
Mm.
and keep safe,
Mm-hmm.
hold sacred. that's
Mm-hmm.
that's what we're here to do. But it's not in the absence of fear. The precursor for courage is fear. You can't be
Mm-hmm.
courageous if you're not afraid of anything.
Right.
But acknowledging that we are afraid, that I'm afraid for the well-being of my family at times. I'm afraid for my own well-being. I'm nervous about the unknown, and to be able to admit that and speak openly about it without feeling weak or made to be weak. It's a multi-gender. It's a whole in conversation that we all need to be having
Yeah.
together collectively about
Right.
how we want the expectations we want to put on men. And
Right.
that's why it's so important. Back to what you asked, that's it's important because it's not something that men go and take care of in isolation around a fire somewhere out in the woods. That's
Mm-hmm.
where we do some of our great work, but it means nothing if it's not an integrated conversation, multi-generationally, multi-genderly, in our
Mm-hmm.
whole community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's so true. Um, there's there's only so much work that we can do on our own just as individuals, and then to have a community to reflect it all back to us and with us, but also like hold that space together,
Hmm.
which is like generally speaking what our collective needs, right? Like we've been for how many generations competing against one another, trying to outdo one another, trying to, and in the process putting each other down, fighting for the top. And there's just this call now for us to start rising together. And I don't know, there's gaps in our ability to do so because for so many of us we haven't learned how. We haven't been shown how. We haven't had it demonstrated in our life, and we've been taught otherwise. And so there's just this real need for it to be shown and demonstrated. And I love that your work is, you do a lot of things live and they're able to connect in that way together, because that's in such an ultra uber digitalized world that we're living in. It's like that in-person connection, and to be amongst each other and each other's presence is so so important. um and you have some really interesting ways that people work with you, and I'd love for you
Mm.
to just share a little bit about that, and how you came to work with men in this way, like in this specific way.
Yeah, well, the conversation I was having back when I was 23 years old, like I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned earlier in the episode, was what does it mean to be a man?
Mm-hmm.
I really didn't know. I had a
Mm-hmm.
great relationship with my dad, still do, but it felt incomplete. Even at that time, I was like, this can't be all of what it means to be a man. I don't agree with everything that I've seen from him or my uncles or my coaches that I'd had up
Mm-hmm.
to that point. And so I was in pursuit of that. I was seeking it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that every boy who's out there on a journey is looking for what their version and definition of a man really is. And so that was my journey, and that's what I was doing when I traveled. I was going out there exploring and trying to discover, well, what is my version of a man? What does it mean to be a man the way I want to be a man?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the communities I encountered, there are actually two. The first one I already kind of mentioned was the culture of men's teams and men's circles that
Mm-hmm.
was really instrumental in my foundations of leadership, understanding men, the masculine dialogue, and complementary to that was my venture into Native American traditions and rites of passage,
Mm-hmm.
and specifically wilderness fasting. So
Mm-hmm.
when I in 2014, I was 26 years old, and I went out and did a vision fast. So 4 days, 4 days, 4 nights out in the wilderness, no
Mm-hmm.
food, just water, and by myself, with myself and nature and the elements. And that was tremendously impactful to me, having that space and that time just of clarity. And so part of my experience there, combined with what I was learning in men's circles and leadership, was to begin weaving those worlds together. So a
Mm-hmm.
huge component of what we do in Rising Man is inviting men to connect with their own definition of what it means to be a man, their vision of how they want to be a leader in the world, and also having a deeper connection with nature as a teacher and the
Mm-hmm.
wilderness as our instructor.
Mm-hmm. Um, I'm all for that. I have a deep connection and reverence to our Pachamama and all that she has to offer us. I love that you
Mm,
mentioned their own definition of what it means to be a man, because I
mhm,
feel like this can be argued. Like, what is the definition? What makes a man a man? What's And then with all the talk nowadays, the healthy masculine, the wounded masculine, the toxic masculine, like what does it mean to be masculine? What does it mean to be a man? And
mhm.
um, I see this in my brothers around me and in my husband, like how they think about this, and it's is tough because you're bombarded with all these different messages, whether it's online and through other people, of what it really means to be a man. But here you are saying, and you encourage them to create their own definition of what it means to be a
Yeah.
man. um so one, I'd like to talk about the masculine versus manhood, toxic masculinity, wounded masculine, and um why you or how you support men in creating or understanding what it really means for them to be a man.
Yeah. Well, first I'll speak to what you said about just every man's definition of what it means to be a man for them.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things that I've learned is the way I think about it is there's this father avatar, right?
Mm-hmm.
Part of the journey from boyhood to manhood is accepting the responsibility from our fathers or anyone in our lives who was like a father to us, accepting responsibility and for our own life. I've got me. Thank you for everything you did. I'm going to take care of myself, which then empowers me to take care of others. So that's one of the thresholds I believe boys need to cross. And so this father avatar is for me the person I created in my mind with all the different parts and pieces that I've come to really appreciate and admire and respect in other men.
Mm-hmm.
So honor and integrity and the men who come to mind when I think about that, they're a part of that avatar. And then service and community and family, things that I value and have decided that's my version of manhood, and the men who I admire and use as a model for that, and
Mm-hmm.
putting them all together in some, masterpiece of an amalgamation of a man.
Mm-hmm.
That's to me my definition of manhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think every boy is ultimately on a journey to compile and put together that father avatar, and all of the things that we witness that we like about
Mm-hmm.
manhood from other men, as well as the things that we witnessed and said, that's not for me. I'm not really about that. Maybe you had
Yeah.
a dad who was absent in your life, and he taught you how you don't want to be a father or a man. It's all relevant.
Mm-hmm.
It all plays into this. So I feel like that's what we are ultimately doing as boys, assembling this version of a man. Just to put a note in here too, I also make a distinction between man and woman, male and female,
Mm-hmm.
masculine and feminine, because I've found that those are actually three very distinct things.
Mm.
And we could talk about that a little bit more, but
Yes, I would love
I
to.
know because for me, man and woman is something that we identify as.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have the right to tell anybody that they are a man or that they are a
Mm-hmm.
woman or that they're not a man or they're not a woman. That's a
Mm-hmm.
personal preference. I've facilitated workshops and events that had people who've changed genders,
Mm-hmm.
who were born biologically female and identify as male, or some other gender but call themselves a man. I'm like, hey, this is men's work. You're
Mm-hmm.
welcome here because you identify as a man. That's my perspective on it.
Right.
But then when we talk about masculine and feminine, for me, those are just two words that describe a series of qualities
Mm-hmm.
that complement one another in a polar relationship. And then male and female, to me, that's just two out of what seems like 30 or 40 different designations of gender that we can choose. That's a
Mm-hmm.
choice. You can choose a gender identity. So when you look at it, there are three different things that often have been pulled into the same category. We've had
Mm-hmm.
man, male, and masculine be synonymous with each other when it really doesn't work in our
Mm-hmm.
society right now.
Yeah. Yeah, that I mean, that's it. I love that you brought that distinction to the table. I think it's important for people to hear, and I really love the way that you explain it. For me, just like personally, my own journey, just navigating the different qualities of masculine, feminine energy, and understanding the harmonious nature of those energies and how they work, and also how like one isn't bad and one isn't good. Like that's
Right.
been my journey, and it's crazy to me that I like to even become aware of the fact that I had this belief system in me that one was better than the other, or if one was utilized in a certain way it's better, and it's bad if it's utilized in this way. And it just became this entire dismantling process for me, and now I'm just reconfiguring everything by understanding what it is or how it is that I would like to flow through life and what actually ultimately feels good in my system. And so thank you for sharing that. And with that, let's talk about this whole notion of the wounded, unhealthy, toxic, masculine energy.
Yeah.
Because I know you have a few things to say about that.
I got a few, and the first is that I really wish people would stop using the terminology toxic masculinity,
Mm,
because for me, toxicity is poison, and to
mm-hmm,
label anything as poisonous, it ultimately creates a barrier between the healing that needs to occur.
mm,
And I know that our culture and social media is all about buzzwords, and toxic
mm-hmm.
masculinity is a really easy thing for people to latch onto and then also capitalize from.
Yeah.
But if we really care about healing on a societal, multi generational level, then we have to stop labeling people and the way that they're being as toxic.
Mm,
Because for me, there's only one way that people are. Inherently, we are all innately good. We all,
Mhm.
especially men, let's just talk about men and the
Mhm.
masculine, right?
Yeah.
We come onto this planet and we want to be of service. Every man, I've worked with thousands of men at this point. No matter how much shit that they've been through, no matter how wounded that they are, when you cut back all the layers, there's a heart in there that wants to give all of itself to
Mhm.
their people. Period. I've got enough evidence to understand this, you know? And when we start labeling certain ways of being as toxic, then it's creating greater separation.
Mm.
It's perpetuating and further seeding shame, which ultimately perpetuates the cycle of men doing bad things that we don't like as a society because we feel so hurt. Like we don't, again, going back to the boy who was bullied in the locker room, 99 times out of 100, that's the boy who goes back and shoots up the school.
Mm.
And if, and that dynamic, we can blow that up and apply that to everything. That's the
Yeah.
man who objectifies a woman, who gets to the point where he takes advantage of a woman. That's the man who uses abusive language, dominating qualities. He's just mirroring what he probably experienced as a kid.
Mhm.
You know, that you never hear about a story of a guy who does any of this stuff who had a beautiful childhood with both parents fully loving, fully present, and never experienced any major trauma. And it's like, it's never the case. So to
Yeah.
label that toxic, we're making that younger version of that person wrong for having an experience that was out of their control.
Mm.
And I'm not okay with that. I know that this is like a big debate, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who will hear this and say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. And
Mhm.
I get it. But if we really care about healing, then we have to stop labeling things as poisonous,
Mm.
right? We have
Yeah.
to all take responsibility for it. We all created this.
Mhm.
And if we're
It's
not
so
taking
true.
responsibility, then we're just perpetuating the problem and feeding it further.
Right. Um and I just want to clarify to our listeners, like Jetty schooled me on this too in our first conversation. And I was super interested in learning more about his take on this quote unquote toxic masculinity. And it does make a lot of sense to label someone's behavior, presence as toxic when we're really just operating from what we know, you know, and that's just it. We're all, I'm a big believer that we're all doing our own individual best at all times with what we know and what we've been given and what we've been shown. So with that being said, then how do you choose to speak about it? How do we have these conversations around the masculine energies?
Hmm. So here's my disclaimer on this too. If people
Okay.
didn't shut me off by now, then here's a disclaimer I should have said is I also don't condone
Mm.
or overlook any of these behaviors.
Mhm.
Right? I don't condone when a man takes advantage of a woman,
Mhm.
right? Or is abusive to a child. Okay, it's not to excuse any of that behavior,
Right.
right? I think we all get to be held accountable to our actions, but it's always leaving open the possibility for restoration, for rehabilitation, I guess, for lack of a better term, that there's always a pathway back to healing. Because if we cut off that pathway, which is what I believe labeling people and actions as toxic does,
Mhm.
then there's no route to the healing. It's stagnant water. That's what
Mm.
that's what toxicity is, right? It's
Mhm.
it's still water. It's not moving. And so the way that I choose, because I've been in circles with men who have admitted to doing all of these things,
Mhm.
all of the things that you can imagine that would be labeled as toxic. I've done most of them myself, and I've been in circles with men who have done all of them at some
Mhm.
points in time. And if you can create a container where we're not going to judge you for who you've been before and what you've done. We're not gonna make you wrong or make you bad for doing that. We're gonna honor you for having the courage to take ownership of it. But now we're gonna hold you accountable to living to a higher standard.
Mm.
You know, maybe
Mhm.
it's something you can't go and take back, but what can you do to bring that back into integrity? What is the conversation you need to have? What's the restorative action? What do you need to do and be held accountable to moving forward so that doesn't happen again? So that
Mhm.
we don't perpetuate of violence in our culture, violence towards women, violence towards children, violence towards ourselves.
Mm.
And those are the conversations that I'm interested in being. There's this culture of punishment that we have
Mhm.
that is, again, it's more of a modern, more colonial mindset that let's take all the bad, let's put it away somewhere and let it rot.
Mm.
the
Yeah.
prison system,
Mhm.
cancel culture, all this stuff. Let's take all the things that we want to gather up as an angry mob and cluster it together and then package it somewhere and pretend that that poison isn't going to seep back into the earth and pollute our water
Mhm.
a mile down the road. Because that's what happens. It doesn't go anywhere.
Mhm.
It doesn't just disappear off the face of the planet. It just festers and boils and finds another way to impact us. So we're not actually healing anything. We're just trying to distance ourselves from it for a little bit longer. But in reality, we're just packaging that up as a nice present for the future generations to handle. And
Right.
I don't think that's what we're here to do.
Yeah. And that's what perpetuates the cycles that we've all found ourselves in, right? It just keeps going and going and going because we've just keep continued to brush it off or put it aside or not want to look at it.
Mm,
And from what I've just personally witnessed in the last like 4 or 5 years, there's been this opening of like, let's look at this now.
yes. Yeah.
Let's look at this together. Let's look at it and let's navigate through this and let's work on this. And
Let's talk about what we're scared of. Like
right.
when we label things as toxic, well, what are we afraid of?
Mhm.
Because that we label things as negative when we're trying to protect ourselves from
Mhm.
it. So let's have a more courageous conversation all the way around the circle instead of just trying to put more distance between it.
Yeah. Plus like who wants to come into a circle and be labeled as toxic? Like
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't set the stage for a healing experience. That's like setting the stage with an accusation almost. Like
Yeah.
let's demonize you first and then let's pull the demon out.
There you go. Well said.
Right. So, see, I'm learning. I'm learning in this conversation, and I'll definitely no longer be using that term, but it's just also so interesting to hear because it is such a buzzword right now, and there's such a buzz around it. And um, I think for it's almost like, I mean, from my perspective personally, it's almost like men are being demonized in a much harsher way
Mm,
with these types of labels. And if I was in that person's shoes, like it would not make me want to work on it. It would make me want to retract or lash out or react.
mm-hmm.
Whereas, at the end of the day, all human beings just want to be seen, heard, felt, acknowledged,
Mm-hmm.
and um, be to be labeled something like toxic. That's not really seeing, hearing, feeling, acknowledging them at all, or what the history of what led them to be in this presence today.
Yeah. And one of the things that so many men do is we take things really personally.
Mm.
We
Tell
really,
me
really
more about
personally.
this.
Well, so just imagine this, like you said, a guy out there who is interested and starting to see the way that they've been, but
Hmm.
now there's this greater dialogue that people around him and on social media are having about toxic masculinity,
Hmm.
and someone puts up that post with toxic masculinity is dot 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 dot, and
Right.
he reads the bullet points. It's like, fuck, that's me, and people think of me that way. Now all of a sudden his sense of taking things personal
Mm.
and therefore the value that he holds in his
Mm.
community starts to shrink, and it's very isolating, and that's a
Hmm.
very fearful place to be. Now a guy who's done his work, who knows who
Hmm.
he is, knows what he stands for, has faced off with a lot of his own demons, taken responsibility for his past and his current, isn't going to take those things as personally.
Hmm.
Like myself, for example, I see that and I understand it. I've taken the time to really look at it. I've had my really hard processes with it. I've been angry. I've been angry at people who say toxic masculinity
Hmm.
before. I'm a little bit more tame about it now because I
Hmm.
get it.
Right.
But somebody who hasn't done that is going to get shut down by that.
Mm.
And we already kind of talked about, well,
Yeah.
as soon as we start shutting down the path towards healing,
Hmm.
then we're not helping that process anymore. But the fact that men take things so personally, I think it's all part of the historical narrative. Well, we can be hard on men because men can take it.
Hmm.
In some instances, that's true. Men in particular are very resilient. I mean, women also. I'm not trying to isolate
Hmm.
women from this. Humans are very resilient, but we're also humans. We're not superheroes. We're not
Yeah.
Superman where we can just take all the blows and then wake up the next day.
Hmm.
Guys who do a lot of these horrendous and heinous acts of violence and crime on communities and society are guys who have been repeatedly beaten down. And I honestly I understand why they would go to extreme lengths to express their pain, because there was nobody willing to sit down with them and hear it
Mhm.
and see it and give them a possibility towards healing and reconciliation.
Mhm.
And this is a big concept. I mean, this is not something that I expect people to just hear and suddenly shift their mindset around. But and at the best case scenario, I hope that this just invites people to look at it differently. That we're
Mhm.
not that we don't win by making certain people wrong. We win by
Right.
working together towards a solution, and how we can all circle up around this instead of, well, you go take care of this because this is your fault. That's not an adult. That's still a
Mhm.
child.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't win by making people wrong. Um and yet our society continues to breed that into our collective, and it's you know it's interesting. In I am a wife, I have a husband, and I've been in relationships in the past as well as my second marriage. And um what's been interesting for me to witness, especially in this marriage, in this relationship, because of our connection and our ability to communicate with one another, is learning just how important it is for a man um, to feel acknowledged,
Mm-hmm.
for it all. I
Mm-hmm.
think, and I'm speaking for me, myself, someone who identifies as a woman, that we love to be acknowledged. Women, we love it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we take for granted, or we overlook the fact that there are men in our lives, those who identify as male, that really also have that need to be acknowledged for their experiences and for all that they're already doing.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it's easy to point out what we're doing wrong. It's kind of like what you're saying, like the culture of punishment. It's also like we just like to point the finger and here's all the things that you're doing wrong, but not here's all the things that you're doing right.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I have learned just on my journey in my marriage, is it's so important for my husband to hear that, to hear, here's all the things that you're doing right. Here's what I acknowledge you for. Here's what I respect
Mm-hmm.
and honor. And that
Mm-hmm.
for me personally has been a learning, because I don't remember ever being taught or shown that that is important.
Mm-hmm. What a novel concept to motivate somebody into performance by honoring and acknowledging them,
Right.
instead of shaming and guilting them. I mean, what a novel idea. I mean,
Right.
it's so funny when you actually talk about it out loud, but
Mm-hmm.
for generations that's what we've done. We've shamed and guilted and belittled people to
Mm-hmm.
motivate them to perform better.
Right.
Across the board, instead
Yeah.
of honoring people, acknowledging them, lifting them up, and also being willing to point out where we can improve,
Mm-hmm.
but shifting the scales and tilting it a little bit more. I mean, one of the most transformative and profound experiences I had
Mm-hmm.
was early on in my marriage. My wife and I, we've been married almost 7 years now, and we got pregnant with our first child 3 months into marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So early on, I think my kid had just been born, and I feel like I'm just screwing everything up. All the feedback I'm getting from my wife is I'm not satisfied. Life is hard, and it was,
Mm-hmm.
but everything I was getting at home was like, oh man, I am screwing this up.
Mm-hmm.
And to go to my men's team, to sit with men who are twice my age, and to feel just dejected and defeated, and to have them just say, hey, hold on a second, and they all stand me up, and one by one they put their hand on my heart, looked me in the eyes, and told me what I am doing well and how good of a job I am doing. Tears in their eyes, tears in my, I mean, come on, like that. I try to encourage men not to depend on validation as a
Mm-hmm.
lifeline, because I don't think that that's a sustainable way to get what we need, but to be open and willing to receive acknowledgement, because it feels good, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
right? It feels good to be acknowledged for what people see in you, that confirms who you've intended to be all along. Not to be dependent on it, where I'm going around and seeking it, right? Like in
Mm-hmm.
like a codependent fashion, but damn, it feels good. And my wife is great about acknowledging me. She does it all the time, but it means something different when it comes from an older man. I don't know how else to say it. Like when it comes from somebody who knows what I'm going through as a father, as a husband, as somebody trying to provide and pay the bills and fighting my battles every day,
Mm-hmm.
broke me down. And when I get to turn around and do that for other men, I mean, it's like it's tears every time because we put so much pressure on ourselves. I mean, men, we literally die earlier than women do across the
Mm-hmm.
board. Like we're leaders in every major health category because it's tough, it's stressful
Mm-hmm.
taking on some of these roles that most men do in our society. So
Yeah.
it's just beautiful when men can get like loved up on and taken care of too, and not expected to be these superhero stalwarts that the past generations were building us up to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's not something that they receive every day. And now we have spaces like the spaces that you curate and people in this work curate for men to step into to receive that. But do you find that there's not an unwillingness, but maybe an unwillingness to receive from other men, or a hesitation? Like, what really causes a man to shift into that um, mindset of, okay, you know what? I actually need to receive from other men.
It's a practice.
Mm,
I'd be lying if I told you it's like it's like a dimmer switch. It's not like a
mm,
switch that you flick. It's like something that
right.
grows over time. Because honestly, I think guys have been taught not to trust that.
Mm,
I can't tell you the overwhelming majority of men who come into our spaces and say, "I've been avoiding this for years because I just don't trust men. I've
mm-hmm,
been hurt. I've been bullied. I've had guys take things from me, kick my ass, and that those things you don't forget those things. Those are some of our
mm-hmm,
most clear, vivid memories. So I think it's experiencing it, witnessing it in other men too. That was what I sat on a men's circle for the first year. I was just quiet. I was like a fly on the wall. I was
mm-hmm,
with guys twice my age doing things I'd never seen before.
mm-hmm.
So witnessing men do this and being able to trust men again based on what I was witnessing them do.
Yeah.
And then, that first courageous plunge into, hey, here's what's going on for me. And then they didn't run away. They didn't make me feel like shit for it. They didn't tell me I was, call me names or make me feel less than, but saying, hey, me too.
Mm-hmm,
Me too, bro. Yeah, I've experienced that before. I know where you're at. I see you. I get it. And what do you want to do about it? That's the
mm-hmm,
conversation that, in my opinion, mature men have with each other. It's the way we love up on each other. Like,
mm-hmm.
hey, I get it. I see you. And what do you want to do about it? Because you're
Yeah.
powerful. You can do something. That's what every boy, every man needs is
Mm-hmm,
that in their lives. And that's why I'm such a stand for it. Because without it, we get all of the headlines, right? We get the nice guy who just suddenly blew a fuse one day and shot up his whole family.
mm-hmm.
The guy who all these incredible things that just don't make sense to us. But
Right.
when you really dig in and you see what a lot of men are experiencing beneath the surface, it makes sense. It's logical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that, like, I just want to thank you for the work that you do, because it's so, so important. It really is. And it's something that is needed. It's something that I think a lot of men don't realize they need. But then when they realize they need it by that point. And
Mm-hmm.
so to know that there are spaces out there that they can step into and find that sense of community, that sense of acknowledgement, that sense of understanding and belonging,
Mm-hmm.
um, it is so important. So thank you so much for doing the work that you're doing, but also for being the work that you're doing. Because I
Mm-hmm.
think that if it isn't obvious by now, listeners, Jeddy is definitely someone who walks everything that he preaches. Like, he is a testament to his work, and um, that's necessary too, to model it for the men so that they can actually see what it looks like, because they're, again, going back to the fact that a lot of men just didn't see it. They didn't have that modeled for them in their life in any way, shape, or form. And so for them to see what that looks like, what it feels like, it, it's beautiful. It's beautiful work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. It's truly an honor. It's my greatest honor, aside from being a father and a husband.
Mm, I love that. Um, so we are nearing the end of this episode, and I'd love to just know if there's any final thoughts that you want to leave with our listeners.
Yeah, we were finishing up by talking about acknowledgement. One of the
Yeah.
greatest acknowledgement that I believe boys get to receive from men and men get from other men is the rites of initiation.
Mm.
And this is something we didn't really go into much about, but my work in rites of passage is also synonymous with initiation, where um, textbook definition of initiation is being admitted into a secret society, which
Hmm.
secret kind of makes it sound culty, but
Right.
basically it's a community of people who have gone through a shared or similar ordeal
Mm.
that then grants you admittance into this community. And
Hmm.
we've done this, I mean, since the beginning of humans. We've all had different rites of passage initiations. So one of the greatest acknowledgments is when we take these guys out and they go out on their 4-day fast and they're received by other initiated men on the other side. I
Mm.
mean, talk about healing that wound of belonging, that
Mm.
wound of purpose, that wound of who am I. It's a beautiful way to do it. And so I just wanted to put that punctuation mark on it because it's something that's not been available to most of us. Most of us come from cultures that have been lost. And so I just want to let men out there know that those opportunities are available to have that experience and to be seen and witnessed as you step into your version of manhood.
Mm. Yeah. And for those of you listening who want more info on that, I've got Jeddy's links in the show notes, risingman.org. You can also connect with him at Jeddy Azuma on Instagram or Rising Man Movement on Instagram, as well as his podcast, the Rising Man Podcast. And again, those links will be in the show notes. But Jeddy, thank you so much for just sharing your presence, your wisdom, for schooling us on why we got to stop using the term toxic masculinity, but also for being the embodiment of the work that you do and your message. Because I think, if anything, um, there's only so much we can learn through words, and the rest we learn through the embodiment of others. And you really demonstrate that well. So thank you.
Mm, thank you, Ruby. Thank you so much. I received that. And thank you for everything that you do. I mean, deep bows. You've been doing this for like twice as long as I have in the podcast game. And it's truly a labor of love. I always like to acknowledge when I'm a guest on a podcast, I always like
Mhm.
to acknowledge the host because nobody knows, unless they're doing it themselves, nobody knows how much really goes into it. So thank you for doing that and
Mm.
creating spaces where these conversations can happen.
Mm. Thank you. I fully receive that acknowledgement. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining Jetty and I for an episode of today's Thought Leader. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. Be sure to download a few episodes, drop a rating and review. And if you have any insights you'd like to share or questions, please reach out to us on social media at Jeddy Azuma on Instagram, at I am Ruby on Instagram. And let's check back in on Monday for a brand new episode of today's Thought Leader. Thank you, Jeddy. Thank you, listeners. And I'll see you back here on Monday.